Hello, everyone. Now let's listen to the story. It all began with silence, not the peaceful silence of a sleeping house where two souls breathe in unison after 4 decades together. No, this was a different kind of silence. It was heavy, as thick as an early November fog, creeping into every corner, clinging to the velvet curtains and soaking the air. You sat there at the familiar oak kitchen table, your hands clasped on the cool surface, listening to it. It had a tangible weight, a pressure on your chest that made each breath a little harder. This house, which you had built from the bricks of love and trust, now felt alien. It was no longer a home, but a vast stage where a play you knew nothing about was being performed. And you, Grace, felt like an unwilling audience member in your own life. On the wall, the grandfather clock, a wedding gift from your late mother, ticked on steadily. Tick-tock, tick-tock. That sound, once the gentle soundtrack to your family life, now sounded like the gavel of a judging court. Each tick was a silent accusation, a wordless question about the long nights Arthur came home late. The sudden business trips, the invisible distance growing between you. 40 years, a marriage longer than a lifetime. Could it truly rot from the inside out without you ever knowing? The front door creaked open, cutting through your thoughts. Arthur walked in. He wasn't just tired from a long day at work. There was something else in his posture. You saw it in the way his shoulders slumped, as if carrying an invisible stone, in the way he avoided your eyes as he crossed the living room. His face, the face you had loved, cared for and memorized, every line was now a map of exhaustion and an unnamed guilt. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, and the corners of his mouth drooped with a bitter weariness. "Long dinner meeting," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. The familiar explanation, a line used so often it had become meaningless. He tossed his jacket onto the sofa with a theatrical exhaustion, loosening his tie as if it were a noose. You stood up, about to ask if he wanted something to eat, but he had already gone straight to the bedroom and collapsed onto the bed. The familiar springs groaned under his weight. He didn't even shower. You stood silently in the kitchen, listening. A few minutes later, his steady snores filled the oppressive silence. That sound, once a comforting confirmation of his safe presence beside you, now had a mocking tone. How could he sleep so peacefully while you were wide awake, tangled in a web of questions you couldn't name? A strange scent lingered in the air as you walked into the living room to tidy up. It wasn't Arthur's familiar expensive cologne. This was a sweet floral fragrance, a woman's perfume. It felt like a brazen intruder, a silent confession of another world, another life he was hiding from you. The scent clung to his jacket, hung in the air where he had just passed, and it made your stomach clench. A vague anxiety, like a cold draft, began to seep into your heart. You knew, with the deep primal instinct only a wife of 40 years could possess, that something was terribly wrong. You began to clean up your movements mechanical, an effort to keep your hands busy while your mind raced. You picked up his jacket to hang it in the closet. Then you saw his wallet, his phone, his old laptop scattered on the couch. A messiness that was unlike the usually tidy Arthur. And then you saw it. The phone screen was still lit. A new email glowed with a faint blue light in the dim room like a sinister omen. You frowned. An email, Arthur. The man who always complained that technology was too complicated, who would rather make a dozen phone calls than type a short email. He always said, "Grace, that stuff is for the kids. I'm from the old school." But now an email sat there right before your eyes, a digital ghost from a life you knew nothing about. A morbid curiosity, a desperate need to know, overrode the guilt of invading his privacy. Your hand trembled as you picked up the phone. The cold metal sent a chill through your skin. You opened the email. It was only a few words, but their destructive power was greater than a bomb. "You were incredible tonight, Dad." It was followed by a red heart emoji. Time seemed to stop. Your breath caught in your throat. The room began to spin. The letters danced before your eyes, meaningless and sharp. Dad. The simple word echoed in your mind, repeating like a poisonous mantra. Who would call your husband Dad in such an intimate, affectionate tone? With a red heart, your own heart felt as if a shard of cold, sharp ice had pierced it through. Disbelief. That was the first reaction. It had to be a mistake, a wrongly addressed email, a joke from a colleague. You desperately clung to any rational explanation, any possibility other than the horrifying truth that was beginning to dawn. You swiped down, hoping to find a clue, an explanation, anything. But there was nothing. Just a strange email address, a jumble of characters that offered no answers, only more questions. You quickly put the phone back where you found it, your hand shaking so much you almost dropped it. You backed away, staring at it as if it were a venomous snake. The storm inside you now had a name, a shape. It was no longer a vague anxiety. It was a cruel truth, a shattered mirror reflecting the image of a fool. You continued your cleanup like a sleepwalker. You gathered his dirty clothes, intending to take them to the laundry room. A habit of 40 years, you always checked the pockets before washing. Your hand felt a folded piece of paper, crisp and new. You pulled it out. It was a receipt from a fancy steakhouse in San Antonio, dated that very night. San Antonio. Your mind struggled to process the information. But he said he had a meeting in Dallas. A dry, silent laugh escaped your throat. He hated driving to Dallas. He always grumbled about the traffic, the distance. But San Antonio was different. That's where his mother had lived, a place filled with the fond childhood memories he often recounted to you. You glanced at the receipt. Dinner for two. A bottle of expensive Cabernet Sauvignon. Your heart clenched. It was the exact same wine he had bought for your 10th wedding anniversary. You still remembered that night vividly under the flickering candlelight, when he raised his glass and said, "Your love was like this wine growing richer and more precious with time." That beautiful memory, one of the crown jewels of your marriage, was now tainted by deceit. It had become a lie, a faded photograph in an album of betrayal. Who had shared that bottle of wine with him? Who had enjoyed the filet mignon and pasta with him? The receipt didn't name names, but the intuition of a woman, the intuition of a betrayed wife was screaming inside you. You didn't want to believe it. A part of you was still fighting, still trying to find an innocent explanation. But the evidence didn't lie. With a cold resolve, you took out your own phone and took a picture of the receipt and the email on Arthur's phone. You didn't know what you would do with them, but you knew you needed them. They were tangible proof that you weren't going crazy, that your unease was not unfounded. You felt like you were standing on the edge of a cliff. The ground beneath you, the very foundation of your life, was cracking and about to collapse. The urge to find more was overpowering. It was like scratching an itch until it bleeds a self-destructive but unstoppable act. You went to the garage. Arthur's old SUV was still warm, the air thick with the smell of gasoline and that faint, sweet, unfamiliar perfume. It was a testament to the presence of another woman. A cold dread clenched your stomach as you opened the car door. You turned on your phone's flashlight, the weak beam cutting through the darkness, scanning the familiar interior. The driver's side was normal. A few loose coins, an empty water bottle. Your heart was pounding one part of you, hoping you'd find nothing. The other craving a final truth to end this torture. You opened the glove compartment on the passenger side. Your hand brushed past paperwork, old maps, and then your fingers touched a cylindrical object, cool and smooth. It wasn't what you expected. You pulled it out, holding it in the flashlight's beam. Your heart stopped. It was a tube of lipstick, not just any lipstick. It was a high-end, expensive brand you had never used. The tube was a shimmering gold, luxurious and foreign. You opened the cap. The color inside was a vibrant, fiery red, a bold, defiant shade. It wasn't the soft pinks or gentle nudes you preferred. This was the lipstick of another woman, a confident woman, perhaps younger, who was not afraid of attention. The tip was slightly smudged, proof that it had been used recently. You raised it to your nose. A sweet vanilla scent mixed with that same strange perfume assaulted your senses. The shock was so strong you had to lean against the car to keep from collapsing. A tube of lipstick, such a personal item. It wasn't just evidence of infidelity. It was a declaration of intimacy. You could picture the scene with painful clarity, the other woman sitting in the passenger seat, in your space, casually reapplying her lipstick, perhaps after a hasty kiss with your husband. This lipstick was an act of possession, a flag planted on conquered territory. It screamed that there was another woman in Arthur's life, someone close enough to leave traces of herself in the family car. Grief washed over you, not in a violent wave, but in a slow, seeping flood, drowning you. Tears began to fall hot and bitter, the first tears you had shed in years. You cried for the 40 years that had passed, for the vows, for the naive trust of a young girl in San Diego who had given her heart to the man she thought she would spend her life with. It was all ashes now. You felt a sickening urge to throw the lipstick as far as you could to smash it. But a small old part of your mind stopped you. This was evidence. You carefully placed it back in the glove compartment, exactly where you had found it. Then you took a napkin and wiped your hands, scrubbing them furiously, as if to wash away the filth, the betrayal you had just touched. Despair began to creep into your soul. You looked around the dark garage, and for the first time in your life, you felt completely and utterly alone. The man sleeping soundly inside the man with whom you had shared a life, dreams and fears, was now a stranger, a master of deceit who had been living a double life right under your nose. How could you not have seen it? The signs were there, you realize now, but you had been too trusting, too loving to see them. Your faith in the present was shattered. This house was no longer a home. This husband was no longer your husband. This life was no longer yours. It was an elaborate play, and you had just discovered you were merely a supporting actor who didn't know the script. You went back inside, walked through the living room, and glanced into the bedroom. Arthur was still sleeping, his face peaceful, almost innocent in his slumber. The contrast between his serene appearance and the tempest ravaging your soul was cruel and unbearable. That peace was not the peace of a clear conscience. It was the peace of a man accustomed to lying, a man who erased all traces of his guilt before falling asleep. You sank onto the sofa, feeling exhausted to your very bones. Fear began to take hold. Fear of the future, fear of the truth. If he could deceive you so expertly, what other lies were hidden? What was this marriage built on love, or just a convenient habit for him? You looked around the house at the family photos on the walls. You, Arthur, your son, Ethan and his wife Nicole, smiling in a picture taken on Ethan's birthday. A perfect family, a perfect lie. That fiery red lipstick had incinerated it all. It had burned 40 years of memories, melted the foundation of your life, and left you alone in the ashes, shivering in the dark, facing a future more uncertain and terrifying than anything you had ever imagined. You knew there would be no sleep tonight, and you knew that from this moment on, nothing could ever be the same again. The storm had just begun. You didn't sleep that night. How could you, when the world you knew had shattered into a million pieces? You lay there on your side of the bed, listening to the steady rhythm of Arthur's breathing beside you. His back was turned to you, a solid wall of deception. Each breath he took was no longer the sound of a shared life, but an insult, a brazen confirmation of his betrayal. The tears had stopped. A cold emptiness had replaced the writhing agony of the previous night. It felt like the aftermath of a high fever, when the body is exhausted, but the mind is unnervingly clear. The pain was still there, a smoldering coal deep in your chest, but the surface of your soul had frozen over into a layer of ice. A silent, cold rage 1,000 times more dangerous than any scream had begun to form. When the first streaks of dawn crept through the curtains, you were already up. You moved through the house silently, a ghost in your own life. You made coffee, the familiar aroma filling the kitchen, but it brought no comfort. You prepared breakfast, 2 fried eggs, a few slices of toast, a 40-year habit. It was a perfect mask, the mask of a devoted wife, a woman living a quiet, predictable life. Arthur came downstairs, his hair messy, his eyes still heavy with sleep. He sat at the table, took the cup of coffee you offered, and mumbled his thanks. You watched him not with the eyes of a wife, but with the cold scrutiny of a scientist studying a specimen. You saw how he avoided looking directly at you, how his smile didn't reach his eyes, how he hurried through his breakfast. "I have an important meeting today," he said, the same line as always. "I'll definitely be home late." You just nodded, a faint smile on your lips. Inside, a voice was screaming, "A meeting with whom? In San Antonio again, or at some hotel in this city?" But on the outside, you were just Grace, the tired but understanding wife. "All right," you replied, your voice even. "Be careful." He stood up, gave your shoulder a perfunctory pat, and left. The door closed behind him, and the silence returned. But this time, it was no longer the silence of fear and suspicion. It was the silence of a war room where a strategist was beginning to draw up her plans. You cleared the table, washing each dish, one by one. The rhythm of the manual labor helped you think. That fiery red lipstick, the restaurant receipt, the intimate email. They were pieces of evidence, but they only told part of the story. They spoke of an affair, but they didn't explain the why or the extent of the betrayal. You needed to know everything. You needed the raw, brutal truth, not to torture yourself, but to know exactly who your enemies were and how far they had gone. And then you remembered Mrs. Sullivan, your kind old friend, the woman with sharp intuition, who had once mentioned a private investigator. "Grace, if you ever need him," she had said, "he's very discreet and reliable." At the time, you had thought you would never need such a service. Your life was too normal, too stable. What a laughable thought that was now. You picked up your phone. Your fingers were no longer trembling. They were steady and decisive as you dialed Mrs. Sullivan's number. Your voice, when you spoke, was terrifyingly calm. "Hello, Mrs. Sullivan. I need Frank's number." There was no hesitation, no lengthy explanation, just a clear objective. That call felt like crossing a river, leaving the land of innocence and suffering behind to step into a new territory of truth and action. The tears were dry, and the ice in your heart was ready. The small cafe downtown was bathed in soft light and the smell of roasted coffee. You chose a secluded corner where you could observe everything without being noticed. You had become an observer, a ghost in the bustling stream of life. Frank walked in a middle-aged man, plain and unremarkable. It was his very ordinariness that made him perfect for the job. He sat down, his eyes looking at you with a perceptive gaze devoid of pity, only professionalism. You didn't say much. You handed him a USB drive where you had saved the photos from the night before. "This is everything I have," you said, your voice perfectly steady. "I think my husband is cheating on me." Saying the words out loud no longer felt like ashes in your mouth. It felt like stating an objective fact, a problem to be solved. Frank nodded, reviewing each image on his phone. "I understand, Mrs. Roberts. I'll start surveillance on Mr. Roberts this afternoon." You left the cafe and walked through the crowd, but you no longer felt alone. The cold rage was your companion. It gave you purpose focus. You returned to your bakery, immersing yourself in work. The familiar smell of flour and vanilla, the scent of the career you had built with your own sweat and tears, now carried a new meaning. It wasn't just a bakery. It was your legacy, your independence, and it was something you would protect at any cost. That night, as you were reviewing delivery invoices, your phone vibrated. A message from Frank. Your heart skipped a beat, but your hand was steady as you opened it. It was a photograph. Arthur, in the light blue shirt he often wore, entering a fancy restaurant. And holding his hand radiant in a tight black dress was Nicole, your daughter-in-law. Even though your gut had told you, seeing the photographic proof was still a shock. You zoomed in on the picture. Nicole was wearing heavy makeup, her lips a defiant red, the exact shade of the lipstick you had found. They didn't look like a father-in-law and daughter-in-law. They looked like a couple on a date, their bodies turned toward each other, an undeniable intimacy between them. The rage inside you began to boil, but the icy surface held. It only made the cold within you even more chilling. Nicole, the girl you had welcomed into your family, whom you had treated like a daughter. You remembered the family gatherings, how Nicole always seemed distant, almost annoyed with Arthur. Ethan, your son, had even joked, "Mom, I think Nicole can't stand Dad. She avoids him like the plague." You now realized it wasn't annoyance. It was an act. A masterful performance they had both staged to deceive you, to deceive Ethan, to deceive the whole world. More photos arrived in quick succession. Them sitting in a secluded corner, candles and flowers on the table, Nicole leaning toward Arthur, smiling, while he raised his glass to her with a look of strange tenderness. You stared at that look. In 40 years, you had never seen him look at you like that, not even when you were a young girl with long hair and a radiant smile in San Diego. That look, a look of pure adoration, of a love you thought was yours, was now hers. In the middle of the night, a short video arrived. You put in your headphones, a desperate attempt to keep this secret contained. In the video, Nicole leaned close to Arthur's ear, whispering something that made him laugh out loud, a sound that was a stranger to you. Then they stood up to leave, and Arthur, ever the gentleman, opened the car door for her. Sadness and anger mingled, creating a bitter taste in your throat. But the next piece of evidence pushed all those emotions into a new realm, utter contempt and disgust. It was an audio file. Frank had managed to record their conversation in the parking lot of a hotel where they had spent the night together after dinner. You pressed play. The first voice was Nicole's, cold and ambitious, the voice of a stranger. Dad, hurry up with that fake contract. I want that whole chain of bakeries. I want to get that old hag out of the house. That old hag. The words hit you like a physical blow. It wasn't just an insult. It was dehumanizing. It stripped you of your name, of your 40 years as a wife, a mother, a creator of a business, and reduced you to an obstacle, a piece of trash to be swept away. Then came Arthur's voice, deep and confident. Don't worry about the papers. Grace doesn't know anything. Just leave it in my hands. She trusts me too much. You closed your eyes. The ice in your heart cracked, not to let tears through, but to release a lava flow of pure disdain. They weren't just having an affair. They weren't just betraying you. They were plotting to steal everything from you. Your bakery chain, the result of sleepless nights of sweat and tears. Your home, the place you had built into a sanctuary. They wanted to take it all, and Arthur was using your love and trust as a weapon against you. It was depravity of the highest order, boundless greed, unrestrained cruelty. The pain of romantic betrayal now seemed so small compared to the outrage of this malicious plot. Arthur and Nicole weren't just cheaters. They were vultures, waiting to pick your life apart. The scorn you felt for them was so profound, it almost cleansed you of your pain. You were no longer sad for yourself. You just felt an infinite contempt for those two despicable human beings. That audio file changed everything. This was no longer a story about a broken heart. It had become a war for survival, to protect what was yours. The pain had been distilled into resolve. The rage had been forged into purpose. You were no longer a passive victim. You were a warrior. That night, you no longer looked at the sleeping Arthur with anguish. You looked at him with cold calculation. You analyzed him. His arrogance, his complacency, his blind confidence that you would never find out, that you were too weak to do anything. That confidence, the weapon he planned to use against you, would now become his fatal flaw. You began to work methodically. You created an encrypted folder on an external hard drive. You saved every photo, every video, every audio file. You carefully noted the date, time, and location for each piece of evidence. Each saved file was like a bullet being loaded into a magazine. You were no longer gathering evidence in despair. You were building an arsenal. Your mind, once filled with pastry recipes and delivery schedules, was now a workshop. You began to think about your next moves. You couldn't just confront them. A simple exposé would bring you the truth, but it wouldn't bring you justice. They had conspired to humiliate you, to throw you out on the street. They deserved a punishment to match a public and mortifying exposure so complete that they would never recover. You needed a plan that would not only reveal their affair, but also their plot to steal your assets. A plan that would make them pay for every lie, every act of betrayal, every contemptuous word. The thought of revenge no longer had the color of a heated emotion. It had become a logic problem, a complex game of chess. You needed to lure them into a trap they would willingly walk into. You needed witnesses, and you needed a climactic scene, an undeniable event that would burn their world of lies to the ground right before everyone's eyes. You looked out the window, where the night was slowly giving way to a new day. An idea began to sprout in your mind, as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. It was bold, it was ruthless, and it was perfect. You had the evidence, you had the resolve. Now you had the beginning of a plan. Your emotions had been completely transformed into will. You were no longer Grace, the betrayed wife. You had become the puppet master, the director of their final act. And you would make sure that when the curtain fell, they would be the only ones destroyed on the stage. Your plan was not born from a burst of anger, but was honed in the cold silence of sleepless nights. It was precise, meticulous, and ruthless, a mirror, reflecting the calculated deception you had endured. Every step was considered, every detail arranged like a master baker preparing their most complex creation. It all started with a lie. You chose an evening when the two of you were eating dinner in the suffocating silence that had become your new normal. You put down your fork, looked directly at Arthur, your face a mask of calm and professional weariness. "Arthur," you said, your voice even, "I have to go to Nashville the day after tomorrow to sign a contract with a new partner. It's a big deal for the bakery chain. I'll probably be back late." You watched him out of the corner of your eye, a flicker of surprise, and then immediately an unmistakable glint of relief in his eyes. It wasn't concern for your trip. It was liberation. He reached across the table and took your hand, a hollow gesture of support. "Really? A big contract? That's wonderful, Grace. Don't worry about a thing. You go ahead. I'll take care of everything at home." His grip was weak, and his smile was empty. Your lie was the bait, and he had taken it without a moment's hesitation. In that instant, any last shred of doubt you might have had vanished, and your resolve hardened like steel. The night before your trip, the house was dark and quiet. Arthur was fast asleep, his snoring the soundtrack to your secret preparations. You moved like a ghost, your heart beating a tense rhythm, but your hands were surprisingly steady. First, the bedroom. You took out Ethan's old voice recorder, the one you bought him for college lectures. You put in a new battery and set it to continuous recording. You hid it skillfully behind the small bookshelf, on the headboard, right behind the wedding photo of Ethan and Nicole. The picture of a happy family, a radiant lie, would now become a silent witness to its own undoing. You adjusted it carefully so it was invisible. The most sacred space of your marriage had now become an interrogation room. Next, you went to the bathroom. A few days earlier, while cleaning, you had found a bottle of lavender-scented massage oil in Arthur's gym bag, something the two of you hadn't used in years. It was another piece of evidence, but you hadn't thrown it away. You had saved it for this. Using a small syringe, you extracted the romantic fragrant oil. In its place, you injected a mixture you had prepared earlier, a theatrical-grade dye, a deep fuchsia color skin-safe, but incredibly difficult to wash off. You had tested it on a cloth. The color was brilliant, humiliating. You gently shook the bottle. The pink liquid swirled inside, looking like nothing more than a harmless cosmetic, a perfect trap in a romantic disguise. Finally, the kitchen. This was the most dangerous step, the point of no return. You took an old pan, filled it with cooking oil, and placed it on the stove. You tied a thin, nearly invisible fishing line to the stove's ignition knob, ran it through a series of small pre-placed hooks, and extended it to the slightly ajar kitchen window. The end of the line outside was tied to a heavy object. With a single pull from a distance, the stove would ignite, setting the pan of oil ablaze and creating a column of thick black smoke, enough to alert the entire neighborhood. Each action made your heart pound in your chest. The tension and anxiety made your palms sweat, but your will never wavered. You were setting the stage for their final act. Early the next morning before sunrise, you were ready. You put on a jacket and picked up a large bag as if you were about to leave for a long trip. You went into the bedroom and gently shook Arthur. "I have to leave for the bus station now," you said calmly. "Important contract," he just grumbled in his sleep. "Okay, be safe, Grace," and buried his face back into the pillow. You looked at the man who was once your entire world one last time, not with love, but with a cold pity. He was sleeping in his own ignorance, completely unaware of the trap that awaited him. But you didn't go to the bus station. You walked straight across the street to Mrs. Eleanor's house. Your kind neighbor and friend opened the door, her eyes worried, but asking no questions. She just quietly made you a cup of hot coffee and showed you to a chair by her living room window. From here, you had a perfect view of your front door, an observation post, a position of power. You sat there, the warm cup in your hands, and waited. Around 10 in the morning, a taxi pulled up in front of your house. Nicole got out. She was wearing a light floral dress and large sunglasses like a movie star trying to hide her identity. A pathetic attempt. Arthur rushed to open the door, glanced around furtively, and quickly ushered her inside. You gripped your coffee cup, your heart beginning to beat a frantic drum. The show was about to begin. You took out your phone, put in your headphones, and activated the app connected to the voice recorder. The sounds from your bedroom streamed directly into your ears. Nicole's giggles, the clinking of glasses, then Arthur's deep voice. "See? We don't have to hide in hotels anymore." Nicole laughed. "You really know how to pick your moments. The old hag is gone, right?" The old hag. The slur hit your ears once more, but this time it caused no pain, only reinforcing your resolve. You kept listening, forcing yourself to hear the sounds of their intimacy, the creaking of the bed. Each sound was a knife twist, but also the necessary poison to allow you to deliver the final, ruthless blow. A few minutes later, you heard Nicole's piercing scream. "What the hell is this? What did we get on us?" Her voice was filled with panic. Arthur growled, "Shut up! Wait! Let me see!" Then his own curses filled the air. You smiled a cold, mirthless smile. The massage oil had done its job. You could imagine the scene: two naked bodies stained with hideous streaks of fuchsia, an indelible mark of their filth. It was time. Your finger swiped across your phone's screen, activating the remote mechanism. The fishing line pulled taut. The stove knob turned. A click sounded, and the flame erupted, licking at the pan of oil. Almost immediately, a thick black column of smoke billowed out of the kitchen window, curling into the sky like a death signal. Eleanor gasped beside you. "Grace, your house is on fire!" You feigned shock, but inside you felt a strange calm. Neighbors began to pour out into the street, shouting, "Grace's house is on fire! Call the fire department!" A man quickly pulled out his phone. In your headphones, the panic was at its peak. "Arthur, do something. Where is this smoke coming from?" Nicole was crying. "Damn it, the door is stuck!" Arthur yelled. He was trying to break down the bedroom door, but it was useless. Everything was going according to your plan. They were trapped. They were stained, and they were about to be exposed. The wail of a fire truck siren sounded in the distance, growing louder. That sound, a symbol of salvation for others, was the death knell for your family. Your heart clenched. You knew who was on that truck. The huge red fire engine screeched to a halt in front of your house. And then you saw him, your son, Ethan. He jumped out of the truck in his fire chief's uniform, his face tense and determined. He was the embodiment of honor, of integrity, of all the good things you had tried to build. And he was about to walk into the worst truth of his life, a truth orchestrated by your own hands. "Get the gear ready now. There could be people inside." Ethan's voice boomed, strong and decisive. A pain as sharp as a knife cut through the icy layer of your satisfaction. You wanted to run out there to hug your son and apologize. Apologize for letting him witness this. But you couldn't. You had come too far to turn back. Ethan led his team using a sledgehammer to break down the front door. The sound of splintering wood echoed in the air. They rushed inside with hoses and extinguishers. In your headphones, you heard the bedroom door being smashed open. Then a dead silence, a silence more terrifying than any scream. And then you heard Ethan's voice, strained, broken. "What? What is this?" A firefighter behind him muttered in shock. "Oh, my God!" Another couldn't help but let out a nervous laugh. But Ethan immediately screamed, "Silence!" That shout wasn't just to maintain order. It was his last desperate attempt to cover his own pain and shame. Your victory had arrived, but it tasted like ash. A firefighter ran out to report that the fire was out, just a small grease fire. But Ethan didn't answer. He was still standing frozen at the bedroom door. And then the final curtain fell. The paramedics were called. They brought Arthur and Nicole out on stretchers. They were wrapped in bedsheets, but that couldn't hide their humiliation. The hideous fuchsia streaks were visible on their faces, necks, and hands, an undeniable sign of their actions. The crowd of neighbors now gathered in full force gasped. Whispers started to ripple through the crowd, then grew into open discussion. "That's Arthur and his daughter-in-law. My God, what were they doing in there? Why are they pink? What a disgrace! Poor Grace." Eleanor beside you silently took out her phone and started recording. She looked at you, her eyes filled with both pity and admiration. You said nothing, just gave a slight nod. You weren't looking at Arthur or Nicole. Your eyes were fixed on one person, Ethan. Your son stood there in the middle of his yard, in the ruins of his family. His chief's uniform looked tragically out of place. He stood motionless, his arms hanging limp at his sides, his face as white as a ghost. His eyes were empty, staring at nothing. Shock, disgust, pain, shame. All those emotions flickered across his face, creating an expression of complete devastation. He had seen his father and his wife in the most humiliating state imaginable. He had had to lead his team into the scene of their betrayal. He had had to endure the curious stares and whispers of the entire neighborhood aimed at his family. The feeling of victory inside you dissolved, leaving only ashes. You had succeeded. You had exposed them. You had made them pay. But that price was paid with your own son's shattered heart. You had won the war against your betrayers, but you realized in the deepest agony that you had also destroyed a part of the world of the one person you loved most. You stood there in the middle of the crowd, a lonely victor, and wondered if justice was truly worth such a cost. The ambulance siren faded into the distance, taking the two culprits with it, and leaving a dead silence in its wake. The crowd of neighbors, their curiosity satisfied, also began to disperse their whispers, dissolving into the air. All that remained was you and Ethan standing in the yard amidst the visible and invisible wreckage. Your house, with its shattered front door, looked like an open wound. Any feeling of victory, if it ever existed, had evaporated as quickly as the last wisp of smoke from the oil pan. In its place was an immense emptiness. The adrenaline had faded, leaving you physically and emotionally exhausted. You had executed your plan perfectly. You had exposed them. You had won. But what did this victory taste like? It tasted of ashes, of an irreparable loss. The family you had spent a lifetime building was no more. It had been incinerated in the very fire of justice you had ignited. You walked over to Ethan, your son, the strong man, the brave fire chief, now looked so small and fragile. He had sunk onto the front steps, burying his face in his hands, which still smelled of smoke. He wasn't crying, but his shoulders shook with silent sobs. That pain was worse than 1,000 tears. You placed a hand on his shoulder, a gentle touch. "Ethan," you whispered. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "Why, Mom?" His voice broke. "Why, Dad? And why her?" You had no answer that could soothe that kind of pain. You just sat down beside him, and the two of you sat there in silence, two survivors on a desolate island after a terrible storm. The final confrontation took place at the hospital. Its sterile, cold environment was a harsh contrast to the emotional chaos of the morning. You didn't go there to continue your revenge. The play was over. You went there to cut the final strings. You had called your lawyer as soon as the ambulance left. When you arrived at the hospital, he was already there handing you a thick folder. Inside was all the evidence you had collected and 2 sets of divorce papers already prepared. You walked into Arthur's hospital room. The nurses had cleaned off most of the dye, but faint fuchsia stains still clung to his skin like a mark of shame. He saw you, and a desperate flicker of hope appeared in his eyes. "Grace," he began, his voice hoarse, "I can explain." You raised a hand, cutting him off. There was no rage left, only an infinite weariness. "There's no need, Arthur. There's nothing to explain." You placed the divorce papers on the bedside table. The crisp white paper, with its clear black text, looked final and ruthless. 40 years. You said, your voice even devoid of any emotion. "It ends here. Sign it and then disappear from my life and my son's life." He stared at the papers, then at you, the desperation in his eyes turning to panic. "Grace, please." You turned and walked away without looking back. The scene in Nicole's room was similar. She was sobbing hysterically, her face a mess of dye and tears. When Ethan walked in with you, she cried out, "Ethan, honey, forgive me. I made a terrible mistake. I beg you, please forgive me." But Ethan just stood there, his face like stone. He didn't say a word. He didn't look at her. His silence was more damning than any accusation. He placed the second set of divorce papers on her bed, then turned his back and walked out of the room, out of his marriage. You and Ethan left the hospital together. The afternoon sun shone down, but you only felt cold. The war was over, but you didn't feel like a victor. You felt like a soldier returning from a brutal battle, having lost all your comrades and left alone with your scars. The first few weeks after the scandal passed in a hazy dream. The house felt too big, too quiet. This silence was no longer heavy with secrets, but empty with loss. Ethan moved back in with you. He brought only a small suitcase, as if he were just a temporary guest in his own childhood home. He didn't talk much about what had happened. The names Arthur and Nicole were never mentioned. The two of you were like 2 planets knocked out of orbit, slowly learning how to revolve around each other, forming a new, smaller, more fragile solar system. Your sanctuary, your place of healing, was the bakery. Work became a refuge, a salvation. The familiar rhythm of kneading dough in the early morning, the comforting aroma of baking bread filling the air, the tinkling of the bell on the door welcoming customers. All of it became an anchor, keeping you from being swept away in the currents of grief. News of the scandal had spread throughout the neighborhood. The video Eleanor had taken had become something of a local phenomenon. But instead of nosy curiosity, you received an unexpected wave of support. Your bakery became busier than ever. People came not just to buy pastries, but to show their solidarity. "You are so strong, Grace," Eleanor said one morning, holding a bag of sweet rolls. "This whole neighborhood is proud of how you protected your family and your business through all that filth." You just smiled and thanked her. Their support was heartwarming, but the real healing had to come from within. And it came slowly through small, simple moments. You and Ethan worked side by side, mostly in silence at first. He managed the counter and the orders while you focused on baking. His presence beside you was a quiet comfort. Gradually, the silence began to be filled with short conversations. Mom, the Grand Hotel wants to increase their pastry order for next week. All right, son. Confirm the order. I'll prepare more dough. Dinners were just the two of you. You sat opposite each other in the small kitchen. No more lies, no more charades, just the simple truth of two people sharing a meal. One night, after nearly a month of silence about the past, Ethan spoke up, his voice hesitant. Mom, this weekend, could you make me some flan? Your heart melted. Flan, his favorite dessert since he was a child, the one you had once taught Nicole how to make. It wasn't just a request for a dessert. It was an attempt to reconnect with the good memories, to affirm that not everything in their past was a lie. Of course, you replied, a real smile, the first in a long time spreading across your face. But you have to help me stir the caramel. He nodded, and a faint smile touched his own lips. That weekend, your kitchen was once again filled with the sweet smell of caramelizing sugar. The two of you made the flan together, the movements familiar and rhythmic. In that moment, you felt a peace you thought you would never feel again. The wound was still there, but it was beginning to heal, enveloped in love and resilience. You also began to rediscover yourself. For 40 years, you had been Arthur's wife. Now, you were just Grace. Who were you? What did you want? You joined a cooking club at the community center where women your age shared recipes and life stories. For the first time, you felt you belonged somewhere outside of your family and your bakery. You started taking walks by yourself every morning, breathing in the fresh air and sorting through your thoughts. You hadn't realized how much of yourself you had lost until you began to find it again. A year passed. Time doesn't erase scars, but it fades them and teaches you how to live with them. One Friday afternoon, your bakery was bustling with customers. The bell on the door rang nonstop. The smell of sweet bread filled the air. You sat behind the counter, watching the people come and go on the street. You looked at Ethan. He was laughing with a regular customer, his smile now natural and bright. He had returned to his work at the fire department, but still spent his free time helping you manage the bakery. He was more mature, quieter, but the light was back in his eyes. That evening, as you had dinner, he told you about a fire at the market. It was really dangerous, Mom, but luckily no one was hurt. You listened, your heart filled with pride. Please be careful. You said, your voice trembling slightly. You're all I have left. Ethan looked at you with a gentle gaze. Don't worry, Mom. I'll never leave you alone. Those words were like a balm reinforcing the strength within you. You had lost a husband, but you had found your son again in a deeper, more meaningful way. You looked around your bakery at the trays of golden flan and flaky croissants. This was your empire. You had built it with your own two hands, from a young girl with a dream in San Diego to a woman who knew how to weather any storm. Arthur and Nicole had wanted to take it all, but they had failed. You thought about your journey, the initial shock, the heart-wrenching pain, the cold rage, the iron resolve, and finally the rebirth. You had not let betrayal define you. You had refused the role of a victim. You had fought back not just with emotion, but with intelligence and calculation. You had rewritten the ending to your own story. The real victory wasn't the moment they were carried away on stretchers in humiliation. The real victory was this moment, right here, the peace in your soul, the thriving business, the smile back on your son's face, the proud feeling of knowing you had risen from the ashes on your own, stronger, wiser, and freer than ever before. You had lost a family, but you had found yourself, and that you realized was the greatest victory of all. You are Grace, a baker, a mother, a survivor, and most importantly, you are the master of your own life. If you found this story helpful, please like and subscribe to Porchlight Diaries so I can keep sharing. Comment where you're watching from and which part touched your heart. Maybe it'll send a little hope to someone who needs it today. Thank you for listening with such kindness.